Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The Will to Power. We are up to Aphorism, or section 391, and over this is the title, section D, A Criticism of the Words, Improving, Perfecting, Elevating. The standard according to which the value of moral valuations is to be determined. The fundamental fact that has been overlooked. The contradiction between becoming moral and the elevation and the strengthening of the type man. Homo natura, the will to power. 392. Moral values regarded as values of appearance and compared with physiological values. 393. Reflecting upon generalities is always retrograde. The last of the desiderata concerning men, for instance, have never been regarded as problems by philosophers. They always postulate the improvement of man, quite guilelessly, as though by means of some intuition they had been helped over the note of interrogation following the question, why necessarily improve? To what extent is it desirable that man should be more virtuous, or more intelligent, or happier? Granting that nobody yet knows the wherefore of mankind, all such desiderata have no sense whatever. And if one aspires to one of them, who knows? Perhaps one is frustrating the other. Is an increase of virtue compatible with an increase of intelligence and insight? Dubito. Only too often shall I have occasion to show that the reverse is true. Has virtue, as an end, in the strict sense of the word, not always been opposed to happiness hitherto? And again, does it not require misfortune, abstinence, and self-castigation as a necessary means? And if the aim were to arrive at the highest insight, would it not therefore be necessary to renounce all hope of an increase in happiness, and to choose danger, adventure, mistrust, and seduction as a road to enlightenment? And suppose one will have happiness. Maybe one should join the ranks of the poor in spirit. 394. The wholesale deception and fraud of so-called moral improvement. We do not yet believe that one man can be another if he is not that other already. That is to say, if he is not, as often happens, an accretion of personalities, or at least of parts of persons. In this case it is possible to draw another set of actions from him into the foreground, and to drive back the older man. The man's aspect is altered, but not his actual nature. It is but the merest factum brutum that anyone should cease from performing certain actions, and the fact allows of the most varied interpretations. Neither does it always follow therefrom that the habit of performing a certain action is entirely arrested, nor that the reasons for that action are dissipated. He whose destiny and ability make him a criminal never unlearns anything, but is continually adding to his store of knowledge, and long abstinence acts like a sort of tonic on his talent. Certainly, as far as society is concerned, the only interesting fact is that someone has ceased from performing certain actions, and to this end society will often raise a man out of the circumstances which make him able to perform those actions. This is obviously a wiser course than that of trying to break his destiny and his particular nature. The Church, which has done nothing except to take the place of and to appropriate the philosophic treasures of antiquity, starting out from another standpoint and wishing to secure a soul or the salvation of a soul, believes in the expiatory power of punishment, as also in the obliterating power of forgiveness, both of which suppose the processes are deceptions due to religious prejudice. Punishment expiates nothing, forgiveness obliterates nothing. What is done cannot be undone. Because someone forgets something, it by no means proves that something has been wiped out. An action leads to certain consequences, both among men and away from men. And it matters not whether it is met with punishment, or whether it has been expiated, forgiven, or obliterated. It matters not even if the Church meanwhile canonizes the man who performed it. The Church believes in the things that do not exist. It believes in souls. It believes in influences that do not exist, in divine influences. It believes in states that do not exist, in sin, redemption, and spiritual salvation. In all things it stops at the surface and is satisfied with signs, attitudes, words to which it lends an arbitrary interpretation. It possesses a method of counterfeit psychology, which is thought out quite systematically. 395. Quote, illness makes men better, end quote. This famous assumption, which is to be met with in all ages, and in the mouth of the wizard quite as often as in the mouth and maw of the people, really makes one ponder. In view of discovering whether there is any truth in it, one might be allowed to ask whether there is not perhaps a fundamental relationship between morality and illness. Regarded as a whole, could not the improvement to mankind, that is to say, the unquestionable softening, humanizing, and taming with which the European has undergone within the last 2 centuries, be regarded as the result of a long course of secret and ghastly suffering, failure, abstinence, and grief? Has illness made Europeans better? Or, put into other words, is not our modern soft-hearted European morality, which could be likened to that of the Chinese, perhaps an expression of physiological deterioration? It cannot be denied, for instance, that wherever history shows us man in a state of particular glory and power, his type is always dangerous, impetuous, and boisterous, and cares little for humanity. And perhaps, in those cases in which it seems otherwise, all that was required was the courage or subtlety to see sufficiently below the surface in psychological matters, in order even in them to discover the general proposition, quote, the more healthy, strong, rich, fruitful, and enterprising a man may feel, the more immoral he will be as well, end quote. A terrible thought to which one should on no account give way. Provided, however, that one takes a few steps forward with his thought, how wondrous does the future then appear! What will then be paid for more dearly on earth than precisely this very thing which we are all trying to promote, by all means in our power, the humanizing, the improving, the increased civilization of man? Nothing would then be more expensive than virtue, for by means of it the world would ultimately be turned into a hospital. And the last conclusion of wisdom would be, everybody must be everybody else's nurse. Then we should certainly have attained to the quote-unquote peace on earth so long desired. But how little joy we should find in each other's company, how little beauty, wanton spirits, daring, and danger, so few actions which would make life on earth worth living. Ah, and no longer any deeds, but have not all the great things and deeds which have remained fresh in the memory of men, and which have not been yet destroyed by time, been immoral in the deepest sense of the word? 396. The priests, and with them the half-priests or philosophers of all ages, have always called that doctrine true, the educating influence of which was a benevolent one, or at least seemed so, that is to say, tended to improve. In this way they resemble an ingenuous plebeian empiric and miracle worker, who, because he had tried a certain poison as a cure, declared it to be no poison. By their fruits ye shall know them, that is to say, by our truths. This has been the reasoning of priests until this day. They have squandered their sagacity with results that have been sufficiently fatal in order to make the proof of power, or the proof by the fruits, preeminent and even supreme arbiter over all other forms of proof. Quote, that which makes good must be good, that which is good cannot lie. End quote. These are their inexorable conclusions. Quote, that which bears good fruit must consequently be true. There is no other criterion of truth. End quote. But to the extent to which improving acts as an argument, deteriorating must also act as a refutation. The error can be shown to be an error by examining the lives of those who represent it. A false step, a vice can refute. This indecent form of opposition, which comes from below and behind, the dog-like kind of attack, has not died out either. Priests, as psychologists, never discovered anything more interesting than spying out the secret vices of their adversaries. They proved Christianity by looking about for the world's filth. They applied this principle more particularly to the greatest on earth, to the geniuses. Readers will remember how Goethe has been attacked on every conceivable occasion in Germany. Klopstock and Herder were among the first to give a good example in this respect. Birds of a feather flock together. 397. One must be very immoral in order to make people moral by deeds. The moralist means are the most terrible that have ever been used. He who has not the courage to be an immoralist in deeds may be fit for anything else, but not for the duties of a moralist. Morality is a menagerie. It assumes that iron bars may be more useful than freedom, even for the creatures it imprisons. It also assumes that there are animal tamers about who do not shrink from terrible means, and who are acquainted with the use of red-hot iron. This terrible species, which enters into a struggle with the wild animal, is called priests. Man, incarcerated in an iron cage of terrors, has become a caricature of man. He is sick, emaciated, ill-disposed towards himself, filled with loathing of the impulses of life, filled with a mistrust of all that is beautiful and happy in life. In fact, he is a wandering monument of misery. How shall we ever succeed in vindicating this phenomenon, this artificial, arbitrary, and recent miscarriage, the sinner, which the priests have bred on their territory? In order to think fairly of morality, we must put two biological notions in its place: the taming of the wild beasts and the rearing of a particular species. The priests of all ages have always pretended that they wish to improve, but we, of another persuasion, would laugh if a lion tamer ever wished to speak to us of his improved animals. As a rule, the taming of a beast is only achieved by deteriorating it. Even the moral man is not a better man, he is rather a weaker member of his species, but he is less harmful. 398. What I want to make clear, with all means in my power, is a. That there is no worse confusion than that which confounds rearing and taming, and these two things have always been confused. Rearing, as I understand it, is a means of husbanding the enormous powers of humanity in such a way that the whole generations may build up the foundations laid by their progenitors, not only outwardly but inwardly, organically, developing from the already existing stem and growing stronger. B. That there is an exceptional danger in believing that mankind as a whole is developing and growing stronger, if individuals are seen to grow more feeble and more equally mediocre. Humanity, mankind, is an abstract thing. The object of rearing, even in regard to the most individual cases, can only be the strong man. The man who has no breeding is weak, dissipated, and unstable. 6. Concluding remarks concerning the criticism of morality. 399. These are the things I demand of you, however badly they may sound in your ears, that you subject moral valuations themselves to criticism, that you should put a stop to your instinctive moral impulses, which in this case demand submission and not criticism, with the question, why precisely submission? That this yearning for a why, for a criticism of morality, should not only be your present form of morality, but the sublimest of all moralities, and an honor to the age you live in. That your honesty, your will, may give an account of itself, and not deceive you. Why not? Before what tribunal? 400. The three postulates. All that is ignoble is high, the protest of the vulgar man. All that is contrary to nature is high, the protest of the physiologically botched. All that is of average worth is high, the protest of the herd, of the mediocre. Thus, in the history of morality, a will to power finds expression, by means of which either the slaves, the oppressed, the bungled, and the botched, those that suffer from themselves, or the mediocre, attempt to make those valuations prevail which favor their existence. From a biological standpoint, therefore, the phenomenon morality is of a highly suspicious nature. Up to the present, morality has developed at the cost of the ruling classes and their specific instincts, the well-constituted and beautiful natures, the independent and privileged classes in all respects. Morality, then, is a sort of counter-movement opposing nature's endeavors to arrive at a higher type. Its effects are mistrust of life in general, insofar as its tendencies are felt to be immoral, hostility towards the senses, inasmuch as the highest values are felt to be opposed to the higher instincts, the generation and self-destruction of higher natures, because it is precisely in them that the conflict becomes conscious. 401. Which values have been paramount hitherto? Morality, as the leading value in all phases of philosophy, even with the skeptics. Result, this world is no good. A quote-unquote true world must exist somewhere. What is it here that determines the highest value? What, in sooth, is morality? The instinct of decadence. It is the exhausted and the disinherited who take their revenge in this way and play the masters. Historical proof. Philosophers have always been decadents, and always in the pay of nihilistic religions. The instinct of decadence appears as the will to power, the introduction of its system of means. Its means are absolutely immoral. General aspect. The values that have been highest hitherto have been a special instance of the will to power. Morality itself is a particular instance of immorality. Why the antagonistic values always succumbed. 1. How was this actually possible? Question. Why did life and physiological well-constitutedness succumb everywhere? Why was there no affirmative philosophy, no affirmative religion? The historical signs of such movements, the pagan religion, Dionysus versus the Christ, the Renaissance art. 2. The strong and the weak, the healthy and the sick, the exception and the rule. There is no doubt as to who is the stronger. General view of history. Is man an exception in the history of life on this account? An objection to Darwinism. The means wherewith the weak succeed in ruling have become instincts, humanity, institutions. 3. The proof of this rule on that part of the weak is to be found in our political instincts, in our social values, in our arts, and in our science. The instincts of decadence have become masters of the instincts of ascending life. The will to nonentity has prevailed over the will to life. Is this true? Is there not perhaps a stronger guarantee of life and of the species in this victory of the weak and the mediocre? Is it not perhaps only a means in the collective movement to life, a mere slackening of the pace, a protective measure against something even more dangerous? Suppose the strong were masters in all respects, even in valuing. Let us try and think what their attitude would be towards illness, suffering, and self-sacrifice. Self-contempt on the part of the weak would be the result. They would do their utmost to disappear and to extirpate their kind. And would this be desirable? Should we really like a world in which the subtlety, the consideration, the intellectuality, the plasticity, in fact, the whole influence of the weak was lacking? We have seen two wills to power at war. In this special case we had a principle, that of agreeing with the one that has hitherto succumbed, and of disagreeing with the other that has hitherto triumphed. We have recognized the quote-unquote real world as a quote-unquote world of lies, and morality as a form of immorality. We do not say the stronger is wrong. We have understood what it is that has determined the highest values hitherto, and why the latter should have prevailed over the opposite value. It was numerically the stronger. If we now purify the opposite value of the infection, the half-heartedness and the degeneration with which we identify it, we restore nature to the throne, free from moralic acid. 402. Morality, a useful error, or more clearly still, a necessary and expedient lie according to the greatest and most impartial of its supporters. 403. One ought to be able to acknowledge the truth up to that point where one is sufficiently elevated no longer to require the disciplinary school of moral error. When one judges life morally, it disgusts one. Neither should false personalities be invented. One should not say, for instance, nature is cruel. It is precisely when one perceives that there is no such central controlling and responsible force that one is relieved. Evolution of man. A. He tried to attain a certain power over nature and over himself. Morality was necessary in order to make man triumph in his struggle with nature and quote-unquote wild animals. B. If power over nature has been attained, this power can be used as a help in our development. Will to power as a self-enhancing and self-strengthening principle. 404. Morality may be regarded as the illusion of a species, fostered with the view of urging the individual to sacrifice himself to the future, and seemingly granting him such a very great value, that with that self-consciousness he may tyrannize over and constrain other sides of his nature, and find it difficult to be pleased with himself. We ought to be most profoundly thankful for what morality has done hitherto, but now it is no more than a burden which may prove fatal. Morality itself, in the form of honesty, urges us to deny morality. 405. To what extent is the self-destruction of morality still a sign of its own strength? We Europeans have within us the blood of those who are ready to die for their faith. We have taken morality frightfully seriously, and there is nothing with which we have not at one time sacrificed to it. On the other hand, our intellectual subtlety has been reached essentially through the vivisection of our consciences. We do not yet know the whither towards which we are urging our steps, now that we have departed from the soil of our forebears. But it was on this very soil that we acquired the strength which is now driving us from our homes in search of adventure, and it is thanks to that strength that we are now in mid-sea, surrounded by untried possibilities and things undiscovered. We can no longer choose, we must be conquerors, now that we have no land in which we feel at home and in which we would fain survive. A concealed yea is driving us forward, and it is stronger than all our nays. Even our strength no longer bears with us in the old swampy land. We venture out into the open, we attempt the task. The world is still rich and undiscovered, and even to perish were better than to be half men or poisonous men. Our very strength itself urges us to take to the sea. There where all suns have hitherto sunk, we know of a new world. Part 3. Criticism of Philosophy. 1. General Remarks. 406. Let us rid ourselves of a few superstitions which heretofore have been fashionable among philosophers. 407. Philosophers are prejudiced against appearance, change, pain, death, the things of the body, the senses, fate, bondage, and all that which has no purpose. In the first place, they believe in absolute knowledge. 2. In knowledge for its own sake. 3. In virtue and happiness as necessarily related. 4. In the recognizability of men's acts. They are led by instinctive determinations of values, in which former cultures are reflected, more dangerous cultures too. 408. What have philosophers lacked? 1. A sense of history. 2. A knowledge of physiology. 3. A goal in the future. The ability to criticize without irony or moral condemnation. 409. Philosophers have had, 1. From times immemorial a wonderful capacity for the contradictio in adjecto. 2. They have always trusted concepts as unconditionally as they have mistrusted the senses. It never seems to have occurred to them that notions and words are our inheritance of past ages, in which thinking was neither very clear nor very exact. What seems to dawn upon philosophers last of all that they must no longer allow themselves to be presented with concepts already conceived, nor must they merely purify and polish up those concepts, but they must first make them, create them themselves, and then present them and get people to accept them. Up to the present, people have trusted their concepts generally, as if they had been a wonderful dowry from some kind of wonderland, but they constitute the inheritance of our most remote, most foolish, and most intelligent forefathers. This piety towards that which already exists in us is perhaps related to the moral element in science. What we needed above all is absolute skepticism towards all traditional concepts, like that which a certain philosopher may already have possessed, and he was Plato, of course, for he taught the reverse. 410. Profoundly mistrustful towards the dogmas of the theory of knowledge, I liked to look now out of this window, now out of that, though I took good care not to become finally fixed anywhere. Indeed, I should have thought it dangerous to have done so. Though finally, is it within range of probabilities for an instrument to criticize its own fitness? What I noticed more particularly was that no scientific skepticism or dogmatism has ever arisen quite free from all arrières pensées, that it has only a secondary value as soon as the motive lying immediately behind it is discovered. Fundamental aspect. Kant's, Hegel's, Schopenhauer's, the skeptical and epochistical, the historifying and pessimistic attitudes, all have a moral origin. I have found no one who has dared to criticize the moral valuations, and I soon turned my back upon the meager attempts that have been made to describe the evolution of these feelings by English and German Darwinians. How can Spinoza's position, his denial and repudiation of moral values, be explained? It was the result of his theodicy. 411. Morality regarded as the highest form of protection. Our world is either the work and expression, the modus of God, in which case it must be in the highest degree perfect, Leibniz's conclusion, and no one doubted that he knew what perfection must be like. And then all evil can only be apparent. Spinoza is more radical. He says this of good and evil. Or it must be a part of God's high purpose, a consequence of a particularly great mark of favor on God's part, who thus allows man to choose between good and evil, the privilege of being no automaton, freedom with the ever-present danger of making a mistake and of choosing wrongly. See Simplicius, for instance, in the commentary to Epictetus. Or our world is imperfect, evil and guilt are real, determined and are absolutely inherent to its being. In that case, it cannot be the real world. Consequently, knowledge can only be a way of denying the world, for the latter is error which may be recognized as such. This is Schopenhauer's opinion, based upon Kantian first principles. Pascal was still more desperate. He thought that even knowledge must be corrupt and false, that revelation is a necessity, if only in order to recognize that the world should be denied. 412. Owing to our habit of believing in unconditional authorities, we have grown to feel a profound need for them. Indeed, this feeling is so strong that, even in an age of criticism such as Kant's was, it showed itself to be superior to the need for criticism, and in a certain sense was able to subject the whole work of critical acumen, and to convert it to its own use. It proved its superiority once more in the generation which followed, and which, owing to its historical instincts, naturally felt itself drawn to a relative view of all authority, when it converted even the Hegelian philosophy of evolution, history rechristened and called philosophy, to its own use, and represented history as being the self-revelation and self-surpassing of moral ideas. Since Plato, philosophy has lain under the dominion of morality. Even in Plato's predecessors, moral interpretations play a most important role. Anaximander declares that all things are made to perish as a punishment for their departure from pure being. Heraclitus thinks that the regularity of phenomena is a proof of the morally correct character of evolution in general. 4:13. The progress of philosophy has been hindered most seriously, hitherto through the influence of moral arrières pensées. 4:14. In all ages, fine feelings have been regarded as arguments. Heaving breasts have been the bellows of godliness. Convictions have been the criteria of truth. And the need of opposition has been the note of interrogation affixed to wisdom. This falseness and fraud permeates the whole history of philosophy. But for a few respected skeptics, no instinct for intellectual uprightness is to be found anywhere. Finally, Kant guilelessly sought to make this thinker's corruption scientific by means of his concept practical reason. He expressly invented a reason which in certain cases would allow one not to bother about reason. That is to say, in cases where the heart's desire, morality, or quote-unquote duty are the motive power. 4:15. Hegel. His popular side, the doctrine of war and of great men. Right is on the side of the victorious. He, the victorious man, stands for the progress of mankind. His is an attempt at proving the dominion of morality by means of history. Kant. A kingdom of moral values withdrawn from us, invisible, real. Hegel. A demonstrable process of evolution, the actualization of the kingdom of morality. We shall not allow ourselves to be deceived, either in Kant's or Hegel's way. We no longer believe as they did in morality, and therefore have no philosophies to found with the view of justifying morality. Criticism and history have no charm for us in this respect. What is their charm, then? 4:16. The importance of German philosophy, Hegel. The thinking out of a kind of pantheism, which would not reckon evil, error, and suffering as arguments against godliness. This grand initiative was misused by the powers that were, state, etc., to sanction the rights of the people that happened to be paramount. Schopenhauer appears as a stubborn opponent of this idea. He is a moral man who, in order to keep in the right concerning his moral valuation, finally becomes a denier of the world. Ultimately, he becomes a mystic. I myself have sought an aesthetic justification of the ugliness in this world. I regarded the desire for beauty and for the persistence of certain forms as a temporary preservative and recuperative measure. What seemed to me to be fundamentally associated with pain, however, was the eternal lust of creating and the eternal compulsion to destroy. We call things ugly when we look at them with the desire of attributing some sense, some new sense, to what has become senseless. It is the accumulated power of the Creator which compels him to regard what has existed hitherto as no longer acceptable, botched, worthy of being suppressed, ugly. 4:17. My first solution of the problem, Dionysian wisdom. The joy in the destruction of the most noble thing, and at the sight of its gradual undoing, regarded as the joy over what is coming and what lies in the future, which triumphs over actual things, however good they may be. Dionysian, temporary identification with the principle of life, voluptuousness of the martyr included. My innovations, the development of pessimism, intellectual pessimism, moral criticism, the dissolution of the last comfort. Knowledge, a sign of decay, veils by means of an illusion all strong action. Isolated culture is unfair and therefore strong. 1. My fight against decay and the increasing weakness of personality. I sought a new centrum. 2. The impossibility of this endeavor is recognized. 3. I therefore traveled farther along the road of disillusion, and along it I found new sources of strength for individuals. We must be destroyers. I perceive that the state of disillusion is one in which individual beings are able to arrive at a kind of perfection not possible hitherto. It is an image and isolated example of life in general. To the paralyzing feeling of general dissolution and imperfection, I opposed the eternal recurrence. 4:18. People naturally seek the picture of life in that philosophy which makes them most cheerful, that is to say, in that philosophy which gives the highest sense of freedom to their strongest instinct. This is probably the case with me. 419. German philosophy as a whole, Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer to mention the greatest, is the most out-and-out form of romanticism and homesickness that has ever yet existed. It is a yearning for the best that has ever been known on earth. One is at home nowhere. That which is ultimately yearned after is a place where one can somehow feel at home, because one has been at home there before, and that place is the Greek world. But it is precisely in that direction that air bridges are broken down, save, of course, the rainbow of concepts. And the latter lead everywhere to all the homes and fatherlands that ever existed for Greek souls. Certainly one must be very light and thin in order to cross these bridges. But what happiness lies even in this desire for spirituality, almost for ghostliness. With it, how far one is from the press and bustle and the mechanical boorishness of the natural sciences, how far from the vulgar din of modern ideas. One wants to get back to the Greeks via the fathers of the Church from north to south, from formulae to forms. The passage out of antiquity, Christianity, is still a source of joy as a means of access to antiquity, as a portion of the old world itself, as a glistening mosaic of ancient concepts and ancient valuations. Arabesques, scrollwork, rococo of scholastic abstractions, always better, that is to say, finer and more slender, than the pleasant and plebeian reality of Northern Europe, and still a protest on the part of higher intellectuality against the peasant war and insurrection of the mob, which have become master of the intellectual taste of Northern Europe, and which had its leader in a man as great and unintellectual as Luther. In this respect, German philosophy belongs to the Counter-Reformation. It might even be looked upon as related to the Renaissance, or at least to the will to Renaissance, the will to get ahead with the discovery of antiquity, with the excavation of ancient philosophy, and above all the pre-Socratic philosophy, the most thoroughly dilapidated of all Greek temples. Possibly in a few hundred years, people will be of the opinion that all German philosophy derived its dignity from this fact, that step by step it attempted to reclaim the soil of antiquity, and that therefore all demands for originality must appear both petty and foolish when compared with Germany's higher claim to having refastened the bonds which seemed forever rent, the bonds which bound us to the Greeks, the highest type of men ever evolved hitherto. Today we are once more approaching all the fundamental principles of the cosmogony, which the Greek mind in Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Empedocles, Democritus, and Anaxagoras was responsible for. Day by day we are growing more Greek. At first, as is only natural, the change remains confined to concepts and valuations, and we hover round like the greasing spirits. But it is to be hoped that some day our body will also be involved. Here lies, and has always lain, my hope for the German nation. 420. I do not wish to convert anybody to philosophy. It is both necessary and perhaps desirable that the philosopher should be a rare plant. Nothing is more repugnant to me than the scholarly praise of philosophy, which is to be found in Seneca and Cicero. Philosophy has not much in common with virtue. I trust I may be allowed to say that even the scientific man is a fundamentally different person from the philosopher. What I most desire is that the genuine notion philosopher should not completely perish in Germany. There are so many incomplete creatures in Germany already who would fain conceal their ineptitudes beneath such noble names. 421. I must set up the highest ideal of a philosopher. Learning is not everything. The scholar is the sheep in the kingdom of learning. He studies because he is told to do so, and because others have done so before him. 422. The superstition concerning philosophers. They are confounded with men of science. as if the value of things were inherent in them and required only to be held on to tightly. To what extent are their researches carried on under the influence of values which already prevail, their hatred of appearance of the body, etc.? Schopenhauer concerning morality, scorn utilitarianism. Ultimately, the confusion goes so far that Darwinism is regarded as philosophy, and thus at the present day power has gone over to the men of science. Even Frenchmen like Taine prosecute research, or mean to prosecute research, without being already in possession of a standard evaluation. Prostration before quote-unquote facts of a kind of cult. As a matter of fact, they destroy the existing valuations. The explanation of this misunderstanding. The man who is able to command is a rare phenomenon. He misinterprets himself. What one wants to do, above all, is to disclaim all authority and to attribute it to circumstances. In Germany, the critic's estimations belong to the history of awakening manhood. Lessing, etc., Napoleon concerning Goethe. As a matter of fact, the movement is again made retrograde owing to German Romanticism, and the fame of German philosophy relies upon it as if it dissipated the danger of skepticism and could demonstrate faith. Both tendencies culminate in Hegel. At bottom, what he did was to generalize the fact of German criticism and the fact of German Romanticism, a kind of dialectical fatalism, but to the honor of intellectuality, with the actual submission of the philosopher to reality. The critic prepares the way, that is all. With Schopenhauer, the philosopher's mission dawns. It is felt that the object is to determine values, still under the dominion of eudaimonism, the ideal of pessimism. 423. Theory and practice. This is a pernicious distinction, as if there were an instinct of knowledge, which, without inquiring into the utility or harmfulness of a thing, blindly charged at the truth, and then that, apart from this instinct, there were the whole world of practical interests. In contradiction of this, I try to show what instincts are active behind all these pure theorists, and how the latter, as a whole under the dominion of their instincts, fatally make for something which to their minds is truth, to their minds and only to their minds. The struggle between systems, together with the struggle between epistemological scruples, is one which involves very special instincts, forms of vitality, of decline, of classes, of races, etc. The so-called thirst for knowledge may be traced to the lust of appropriation and of conquest. In obedience to this lust, the senses, memory, and the instincts, etc., were developed. The quickest possible reduction of the phenomena, economy, the accumulation of spoil from the world of knowledge, i.e., that portion of the world which has been appropriated and made manageable. Morality is therefore such a curious science because it is in the highest degree practical. The purely scientific position, scientific uprightness, is thus immediately abandoned as soon as morality calls for replies to its questions. Morality says, I require certain answers, reasons, arguments. Scruples may come afterwards, or they may not come at all. How must one act? If one considers that one is dealing with a supremely evolved type, a type which has been dealt with for countless thousands of years, and in which everything has become instinct, expediency, automatism, fatality, the urgency of this moral question seems rather funny. How must one act? Morality has always been a subject of misunderstanding. As a matter of fact, a certain species, which was constituted to act in a certain way, wished to justify itself by making its norm paramount. How must one act? This is not a cause, but an effect. Morality follows, the ideal comes first. On the other hand, the appearance of moral scruples, or in other words, the coming to consciousness of the values which guide action, betray a certain morbidness. Strong ages and people do not ponder over their rights, nor over their principles of action, over instinct or over reason. Consciousness is a sign that the real morality, that is to say, the certainty of instinct which leads to a definite course of action, is going to the dogs. Every time a new world of consciousness is created, the moralists are signs of a lesion, of impoverishment, and of disorganization. Those who are deeply instinctive fear bandying words over duties. Among them are found Pyrrhonic opponents of dialectics and of nobleness in general. A virtue is refuted with a "for." Thesis. The appearance of moralists belongs to the period when morality is declining. Thesis. The moralist is a dissipator of moral instincts, however much he may appear to be their restorer. Thesis. That which really prompts the action of a moralist is not a moral instinct, but the instincts of decadence, translated into the forms of morality. He regards the growing uncertainty of the instincts as corruption. Thesis. The instincts of decadence, which, thanks to moralists, wish to become master of the instinctive morality of stronger races and ages are 1. The instincts of the weak and of the botched. 2. The instincts of the exceptions, of the anchorites, of the unhinged, of the abortions of quality, or of the reverse. 3. The instincts of the habitually suffering, who require a noble interpretation of their condition, and who therefore require to be as poor physiologists as possible. 424. The humbug of the scientific spirit. One should not affect the spirit of science when the time to be scientific is not yet at hand. But even the genuine investigator has to abandon vanity and has to affect a certain kind of method which is not yet seasonable. Neither should we falsify things and thoughts which we have arrived at differently by means of a false arrangement of deduction and dialectics. It is thus that Kant in his Morality falsifies his inner tendency to psychology. A more modern example of the same thing is Herbert Spencer's Ethics. A man should neither conceal nor misrepresent the facts concerning the way in which he conceived his thoughts. The deepest and most inexhaustible books will certainly always have something of the aphoristic and impetuous character of Pascal's Penzès. The motive forces and valuations have lain long below the surface. That which comes uppermost is their effect. I guard against all the humbug of a false scientific spirit. 1. In respect of the manner of demonstration, if it does not correspond to the genesis of the thoughts. 2. In respect of the demands for methods, which at any given period in science may be quite impossible. 3. In respect of the demand for objectivity, for cold impersonal treatment, where, as in the case of all valuations, we describe ourselves and our intimate experiences in a couple words. There are ludicrous forms of vanity, as for instance Saint Beuve's. He actually worried himself all his life because he had shown some warmth or passion, either pro or con, and he would fain have lied that fact out of his life. 425. Quote-unquote objectivity in the philosopher, moral indifference in regard to oneself, blindness in regard to either favorable or fatal circumstances, unscrupulousness in the use of dangerous means, perversity and complexity of character considered as an advantage and exploited. My profound indifference to myself. I refuse to derive any advantages from my knowledge, nor do I wish to escape any disadvantages which it may entail. I include among these disadvantages that which is called the perversion of character. This prospect is beside the point. I use my character, but I try neither to understand it nor to change it. The personal calculation of virtue has not entered my head once. It strikes me that one closes the doors of knowledge as soon as one becomes interested in one's own personal case, or even in the salvation of one's soul. One should not take one's morality too seriously, nor should one forfeit a modest right to the opposite of morality. A sort of heritage of morality is perhaps presupposed here. One feels that one can be lavish with it and fling a great deal of it out of the window without materially reducing one's means. One is never tempted to admire quote-unquote beautiful souls. One always knows oneself to be their superior. The monsters of virtue should be met with inner scorn. The denial of virtue. Oh, the joy of it! One should revolve round oneself, have no desire to be better or anything else at all than one is. One should be too interested to omit throwing the tentacles or meshes of every morality out to things. 426. Concerning the psychology of philosophers. They should be psychologists. This was possible only from the 19th century onwards, and no longer little Jack Homers, who see 3 or 4 feet in front of them, and are almost satisfied to burrow inside themselves. We psychologists of the future are not very intent on self-contemplation. We regard it almost as a sign of degeneration. When an instrument endeavors to know itself, we are instruments of knowledge, and we would fain possess all precision and ingenuousness of an instrument. Consequently, we may not analyze or know ourselves. The first sign of a great psychologist's self-preservative instinct. He never goes in search of himself. He has no eye, no interest, no inquisitiveness where he himself is concerned. The great egoism of our dominating will insists on our completely shutting our eyes to ourselves, and on our appearing impersonal, disinterested. Oh, to what a ridiculous degree we are the reverse of this. We are no Pascals. We are not particularly interested in the salvation of the soul, in our own happiness, and in our own virtue. We have neither enough time nor enough curiosity to be so concerned with ourselves. Regarded more deeply, the case is again different. We thoroughly mistrust all men who thus contemplate their own navels, because introspection seems to us a degenerate form of the psychologist's genius, as a note of interrogation affixed to the psychologist's instinct, just as a painter's eye is a degenerate which is actuated by the will to see for the sake of seeing. This is the end of Part 10 of The Will to Power. Thank you for listening.